She never asked to be queen. 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey was thrust into the deadliest throne in England, her crown as cold and crushing as the fate it foreshadowed. Raised on scripture and scholarship, not power and poison, Jane's 9-day reign would end not in glory, but in betrayal. Behind her silent walk to the scaffold lies a conspiracy of greed, a father's fatal ambition, and a faith she refused to betray. So why did this brilliant girl have to die? The answer unearths a twist no textbook ever taught. Comment your thoughts on monarchy and manipulation, like For History Untold, and subscribe to discover the truth beneath the crown. The crown felt like ice against her 16-year-old temples as Lady Jane Grey sat on the throne she never wanted, surrounded by men who had thrust greatness upon her like a poisoned chalice. It was July 10, 1553, and the Tower of London's ancient stones seemed to whisper warnings that the brilliant young woman was too terrified to hear. Jane was not just England's youngest queen, but also its most reluctant, a puppet dancing on strings, pulled by ambitious men who saw in her Protestant faith and royal blood the perfect weapon to reshape a kingdom. She had been raised to be a scholar, not a sovereign, educated in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew by the finest tutors money could buy. But no amount of classical learning had prepared her for the brutal reality of Tudor politics, where innocence was a liability and intelligence without power was merely another form of vulnerability. The Tower of London, where Jane found herself proclaimed queen, was a fortress that had already witnessed the executions of two of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both of whom had walked the same stone corridors that Jane now traversed as England's reluctant monarch. The ancient fortress carried within its walls the accumulated terror of centuries, every stone stained with the blood of nobles who had fallen from royal favor, every chamber echoing with the final words of prisoners who had learned too late that proximity to power was often a death sentence rather than a blessing. Jane was acutely aware of this history, as she moved through rooms that felt more like a tomb than a palace, understanding with the clarity that came from her scholarly education that she was likely witnessing her own future with every execution site she passed. The weight of the crown was both literal and metaphorical, the actual gold and jewels pressing down on Jane's skull, while the responsibility they represented threatened to crush her spirit entirely. This was not the lightweight circlet worn by actresses in modern films, but a massive construction of precious metals and stones that had been designed to demonstrate the overwhelming power of English monarchy. The crown had been worn by Henry VIII during his most triumphant moments, by Edward VI during his brief and sickly reign, and now it sat upon the head of a teenager who understood better than anyone that she had no right to wear it, and no hope of keeping it for more than a few days. The path to Jane's doomed coronation began not with her own ambition, but with the religious terror that gripped England in the wake of Henry VIII's break with Rome. Edward VI, Henry's sickly son, lay dying at Greenwich Palace, his lungs slowly drowning in their own fluid, while Protestant nobles watched their world crumble. Edward was not just a king to these men, but a divine instrument of religious reform, and his death would almost certainly mean the accession of his Catholic half-sister Mary, a woman they saw not as a legitimate heir, but as an agent of papal tyranny who would drag England back into the darkness of Roman superstition. The very thought of Mary on the throne sent shivers of genuine terror through the Protestant establishment, men who had built their fortunes on monastery lands and who knew that Catholic restoration would mean not just spiritual persecution, but financial ruin. The religious transformation of England under Henry VIII and Edward VI had created a new class of nobility whose wealth and power depended entirely upon the continuation of Protestant rule. These men had grown rich by purchasing monastery lands at bargain prices, had advanced their careers by supporting religious reform, and had sent their sons to universities where they learned to despise Catholic superstition as thoroughly as they had once been taught to revere it. The prospect of Mary Tudor's accession threatened to reverse all of these gains, potentially returning confiscated lands to the Catholic Church, restoring papal authority over English religious life, and placing Protestant nobles at the mercy of a queen who had excellent reasons to consider them all heretics and traitors. The economic stakes of the religious conflict were enormous, involving not just individual fortunes, but the entire structure of English society that had been rebuilt during the Reformation. Protestant nobles held estates worth millions of pounds in modern currency, supported thousands of tenants and retainers, and controlled parliamentary seats that gave them political influence far beyond their numbers. Catholic restoration would not just threaten their wealth but their lives, as Mary would almost certainly follow the European precedent of treating religious reformation as treasonous rebellion against both crown and church. The men who would eventually manipulate Jane Grey into accepting the crown were fighting not just for their beliefs, but for their survival in a religious war that had already claimed thousands of lives across Europe. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, was the spider at the center of this web of religious and political conspiracy. A man of exceptional intelligence and unlimited ruthlessness, Dudley had clawed his way to the pinnacle of power during Edward's reign, becoming Lord President of the Council and the effective ruler of England while the boy king wasted away from tuberculosis. Dudley was everything that Jane Grey was not: politically astute, morally flexible, and utterly committed to his own survival above all other considerations. He looked at the dying Edward VI and saw not a tragic young king, but a problem that required a solution, and that solution lay in manipulating the succession to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of someone more malleable to Protestant interests. Dudley's rise to power had been built upon a foundation of military success, political cunning, and ruthless elimination of rivals who threatened his position. He had suppressed peasant rebellions with brutal efficiency, outmaneuvered veteran courtiers who underestimated his abilities, and gradually accumulated offices and titles until he controlled virtually every aspect of English government. Dudley understood that power in Tudor England depended upon the favor of the monarch, but he also knew that royal favor could be withdrawn as quickly as it was granted, leaving even the most successful courtiers vulnerable to sudden reversal of fortune. His solution was to ensure that the next monarch would be someone he could control completely, a puppet ruler who would owe their throne entirely to his support and manipulation. The Duke of Northumberland's personality combined intellectual brilliance with moral bankruptcy in ways that made him both fascinating and terrifying to his contemporaries. He could quote classical literature and military theory with equal facility, devise military strategies that saved England from foreign invasion, and implement administrative reforms that improved the efficiency of royal government. But Dudley's talents were always subordinated to his personal ambitions. His loyalty was always conditional upon advantage, and his word was worthless the moment it became inconvenient to honor it. He was the perfect courtier for a corrupt age, a man who understood that principles were luxuries that successful politicians could not afford. Jane Grey was Dudley's perfect candidate, not because she was strong, but because she appeared weak. The great niece of Henry VIII through her mother's line, Jane had an arguable claim to the throne that could be strengthened by parliamentary statute and popular support for Protestant religion. More importantly, she was young, female, and scholarly, qualities that Dudley mistook for tractability. He had watched Jane grow up as a brilliant but sheltered young woman who spoke fluent Latin and could debate theological fine points with university professors, but who seemed completely naive about the deadly games of court politics. Dudley believed he could control Jane as easily as a master puppeteer controls a marionette, using her royal blood and Protestant credentials to legitimize his own continued dominance over English government. The irony of Dudley's assessment of Jane was that her apparent weakness was actually a form of strength that he completely failed to understand. Jane's scholarly interests and religious devotion were not signs of political naivety, but evidence of a serious intellectual engagement with the most important questions of her time. Her reluctance to engage in court intrigue reflected not timidity, but moral principles that prevented her from participating in the corruption that surrounded her. Jane's youth and femininity made her seem controllable to men like Dudley, but they also freed her from many of the compromises and obligations that constrained adult male nobles, giving her a form of moral authority that her manipulators could never achieve. Jane's education had been extraordinary, even by the standards of the Tudor nobility, reflecting her parents' ambitions for their daughter and her own exceptional intellectual abilities. She had been tutored by some of the most learned men in England, scholars who had taught her not just languages and literature, but theology, philosophy, and history. Jane could read the Bible in Hebrew, debate the finer points of Protestant doctrine in Latin, and compose poetry in Greek that impressed university professors. Her learning was not merely decorative, but profound, reflecting a mind that engaged seriously with ideas and their implications for human life and society. The contrast between Jane's intellectual sophistication and her political inexperience created a dangerous blind spot that her enemies would exploit ruthlessly. Jane understood the theological implications of the Reformation better than most bishops, could analyze the historical precedents for royal succession with scholarly precision, and could articulate the moral principles that should guide Christian rulers. But she had no understanding of how power actually worked in Tudor England, no experience with the brutal calculations that determined who lived and who died in the world of court politics. Jane's education had prepared her to be a scholar or a saint, but it had left her completely unprepared to be a survivor. The marriage between Jane and Dudley's son Guildford was the keystone of this conspiracy, a political alliance disguised as a romantic union that would bind the Grey family irrevocably to Dudley's ambitions. Jane was given no choice in the matter, informed rather than consulted about a wedding that would seal her fate, as surely as if she had signed her own death warrant. The ceremony took place at Durham House in May 1553, a lavish affair that masked the coercion behind Jane's participation. She stood at the altar like a beautiful prisoner, wearing cloth of silver and gold, while her heart surely understood that she was trading whatever freedom she had possessed for a crown she never wanted and a husband she barely knew. The wedding celebrations were a masterpiece of deception, presenting to the world the image of a joyful union between two young people, while concealing the political calculations that had arranged their marriage. The guest list included the most powerful nobles in England, all of whom understood that they were witnessing not a love match, but a dynastic alliance that would reshape the balance of power in English politics. The bride and groom played their assigned roles with the skill of trained actors, but observers noted that Jane's smiles never reached her eyes, and that Guildford seemed more interested in the political advantages of his marriage than in his bride herself. The irony of the marriage ceremony was that it was both the beginning of Jane's path to the throne and the first step toward her destruction. By marrying Guildford Dudley, Jane became integral to her father-in-law's conspiracy, but she also became a target for anyone who opposed Dudley's ambitions. The wedding that was supposed to secure Jane's future actually sealed her fate, transforming her from an innocent bystander into an active participant in a plot that would end with multiple executions. Jane understood none of this as she stood at the altar, but her scholarly training had taught her enough about history to recognize that royal marriages were rarely about love and usually about power. Guildford Dudley was in many ways as much a victim of his father's ambitions as Jane herself, a handsome but weak young man who had been raised to be an ornament rather than a leader. Contemporaries described him as vain and petulant, more interested in his appearance than in politics, but even his superficiality could not completely mask his growing awareness that his marriage to Jane had transformed him from a duke's younger son into a target for every enemy his father had made during his rise to power. Guildford knew that if Dudley's conspiracy failed, he would share Jane's fate not because of anything he had done, but because of what he represented, a living symbol of Protestant usurpation that Catholic restoration could never tolerate. The relationship between Jane and Guildford was complicated by their youth, their different personalities, and the political circumstances that had forced them together. Jane was serious, scholarly, and deeply religious, while Guildford was frivolous, fashionable, and primarily concerned with his own comfort and status. Jane sought intellectual companionship and spiritual guidance from her husband, but found instead a young man who was more interested in his wardrobe than in the theological discussions that fascinated her. Guildford wanted a wife who would admire his beauty and defer to his judgment, but found instead a teenager who was more intelligent than he was, and who made no effort to hide her intellectual superiority. When Edward VI finally died on July 6, 1553, Dudley moved with the speed and precision of a man who had planned every detail of his coup for months. Jane was brought to Sion House and informed that she was now Queen of England, a revelation that reportedly caused her to faint from shock. When she recovered consciousness, Jane's first reaction was not joy or excitement, but a desperate plea to be released from a responsibility she knew she was not equipped to handle. "The crown is not my right and pleaseth me not," she reportedly said, words that revealed both her intelligence and her innocence. Jane understood enough about royal succession to know that her claim was legally dubious, but she was still naive enough to believe that her personal preferences might matter to the powerful men who had already decided her fate. The scene at Sion House revealed the complete gulf between Jane's scholarly understanding of monarchy and the brutal reality of how power was actually transferred in Tudor England. Jane had read extensively about royal succession, understood the legal principles that should govern the inheritance of the crown, and knew that her claim was weaker than Mary Tudor's by every traditional measure. But the men who proclaimed her queen were not interested in legal precedents or moral principles. They cared only about preventing Mary's accession and preserving their own power. Jane's protests about her unworthiness and Mary's superior claim were dismissed as feminine modesty rather than legitimate constitutional objections. The psychological pressure applied to Jane during those crucial hours was enormous, combining appeals to her religious faith, her family loyalty, and her sense of duty to create an emotional environment where refusal seemed impossible. Dudley and his supporters argued that God had chosen Jane to preserve Protestant England from Catholic tyranny, that her royal blood obligated her to serve her country's needs, and that refusing the crown would be an act of cowardice that would damn millions of English souls to papal oppression. Jane was a devout Protestant who had been taught to see Catholic rule as a form of spiritual slavery, so these arguments carried tremendous weight with a teenager who was already emotionally overwhelmed by the sudden death of her cousin Edward and the unexpected responsibility being thrust upon her. The 9 days of Jane's reign were a masterclass in political miscalculation by men who understood power but completely misunderstood the English people. Dudley had assumed that Protestant England would rally behind Jane as a bulwark against Catholic Mary, but he had failed to appreciate the deep-seated English respect for legitimate succession that transcended religious differences. Mary Tudor might be Catholic, but she was also Henry VIII's daughter, and to most English minds that made her the rightful queen, regardless of what parliamentary statutes or Protestant theologians might say about the matter. Jane's reign began with the support of the Tower of London's garrison and the handful of Protestant nobles who had engineered her accession, but it never expanded beyond that narrow base to include the broader English population. The failure of Jane's regime to gain popular support revealed the fundamental weakness of Dudley's conspiracy. It was based on the preferences of a small political elite rather than the will of the English people. Dudley had spent so much time maneuvering within the narrow confines of the royal court that he had lost touch with public opinion outside London, assuming that ordinary English people shared the religious and political priorities of Protestant nobles. In reality, most English people cared more about legitimate succession than religious doctrine, more about stability than reform, and more about peace than the theological fine points that obsessed educated Protestants. The geographical isolation of Jane's support was particularly damaging to her cause, as it became clear that her regime controlled little beyond the Tower of London and a few strategic points in the capital. The English countryside remained loyal to Mary Tudor, not necessarily because of religious conviction, but because she represented continuity and legitimacy in an age when both were precious commodities. Jane's inability to expand her base of support beyond London meant that she was essentially besieged in her own capital, cut off from the resources and manpower she would need to defend her crown against Mary's advancing forces. Mary Tudor, meanwhile, proved far more formidable than Dudley had anticipated. Instead of fleeing to Europe or accepting defeat gracefully, Mary rallied her supporters in East Anglia and began a march toward London that quickly transformed from a desperate gamble into a triumphant procession. English nobles who had initially supported Jane began quietly switching sides as Mary's forces grew, calculating that backing the legitimate heir was safer than supporting a usurper whose reign was already showing signs of collapse. Even Jane's own father, the Duke of Suffolk, eventually abandoned his daughter's cause, recognizing that continued resistance would only ensure more severe punishment when Mary's inevitable victory arrived. The speed with which support for Jane evaporated revealed the shallow foundations upon which Dudley had built his conspiracy. Many of the nobles who had initially backed Jane's claim did so not out of conviction, but out of fear of Dudley's power and uncertainty about the alternative. As soon as it became clear that Mary had genuine popular support and military momentum, these fair-weather allies began looking for ways to switch sides without appearing treacherous. The result was a cascade of defections that left Jane increasingly isolated and exposed to the vengeance of the woman she had supposedly displaced. Mary's march from East Anglia to London became a propaganda victory as much as a military one, demonstrating to the English people that the rightful queen had not been intimidated by Dudley's coup and was prepared to fight for her inheritance. Each town that declared for Mary, each noble who joined her cause, and each day that her forces grew larger while Jane's remained static in London, strengthened the impression that divine providence favoured the legitimate heir over the Protestant usurper. Mary's victory began to seem inevitable, even before any major battles were fought, creating a psychological momentum that proved more valuable than military superiority. The collapse of Jane's support happened with breathtaking speed, like a dam bursting under pressure that had been building for days. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane's accession, the very councillors who had proclaimed her queen met in secret to declare Mary as the rightful sovereign. Jane learned of her deposition not from official notification, but from the absence of the guards who had been protecting her, and the sudden silence of courtiers who no longer bothered to maintain the pretense of royal deference. She was alone in the Tower of London, abandoned by everyone except her young husband, when she realized that her brief reign was over and her real ordeal was about to begin. The moment of Jane's deposition was both anticlimactic and terrifying, a quiet end to a reign that had been doomed from its beginning, but that still carried the promise of violent retribution from the woman who would replace her. Jane had spent 9 days as the most powerful person in England, at least in theory, but she learned of her fall from power in the same way she had learned of her elevation, through the actions of men who never bothered to consult her preferences or seek her consent. The teenager who had been proclaimed queen without her permission was now dethroned without her knowledge, a passive figure in a drama that would determine whether she lived or died. The imprisonment that followed was a psychological torture designed to break Jane's spirit before breaking her body. She was moved from royal apartments to a cell in the gentleman jailer's house within the Tower, a comfortable but unmistakably prison-like accommodation that reminded her every day that she had fallen from queen to prisoner in less than 2 weeks. Jane was allowed books and writing materials, privileges that might have seemed merciful, but were actually cruel reminders of the scholarly life she had lost forever. She spent her days reading theological works and writing letters that revealed a brilliant mind, grappling with the theological implications of her situation, trying to understand how God could have allowed her to fall so far so fast. The contrast between Jane's former freedom and her current captivity was made more painful by the knowledge that her imprisonment was likely to be brief, only because it would end with her execution. The books that had once been sources of intellectual pleasure became desperate attempts to find meaning in suffering, while the letters she wrote to family members carried the terrible poignancy of final communications from someone who knew she was unlikely to see her correspondence again. Jane's scholarly training had taught her to find comfort in learning and writing, but even these familiar refuges could not completely shield her from the growing certainty that she was going to die for crimes she had never wanted to commit. The theological questions that occupied Jane's mind during her imprisonment revealed the depth of her religious convictions and the sophistication of her intellectual engagement with Protestant doctrine. She wrestled with the problem of divine providence that had allowed her to become queen only to fall from power so quickly, wondering whether her brief reign had been a test of her faith or a punishment for her sins. Jane's letters from this period show a young woman trying to reconcile her belief in God's justice with the apparent injustice of her situation, seeking spiritual explanations for political events that seemed to contradict everything she had been taught about divine intervention in human affairs. Mary Tudor's initial inclination was to show mercy to Jane, recognizing that the young woman had been more victim than perpetrator in Dudley's conspiracy. The new queen understood that Jane had been manipulated by ambitious men who used her royal blood for their own purposes, and Mary's own experience as a woman struggling against male political manipulation gave her sympathy for Jane's plight. For months it seemed possible that Jane might survive her brief reign with nothing worse than permanent imprisonment, a fate that would have been merciful by Tudor standards for someone who had committed what was technically high treason against the rightful sovereign. Mary's initial mercy toward Jane reflected both practical politics and personal inclination, as the new queen understood that executing a 16-year-old girl would create a martyr for Protestant resistance while serving no useful political purpose. Jane posed no immediate threat to Mary's security as long as she remained imprisoned, and her youth and obvious manipulation by adults made her a sympathetic figure who could be pardoned without appearing weak. Mary had herself been the victim of political manipulation during Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, when she had been declared illegitimate and stripped of her succession rights, so she understood how innocent people could become casualties of adult political ambitions. The Catholic doctrine that emphasized mercy and forgiveness also influenced Mary's initial treatment of Jane. as the new queen sought to demonstrate that Catholic rule would be more compassionate than the Protestant regime that had persecuted Catholics for decades. Mary wanted to show that she could be magnanimous in victory, forgiving her enemies and healing the religious divisions that had torn England apart during Edward VI's reign. Executing Jane would have contradicted this image of merciful Catholic restoration and might have alienated moderate Protestants who could be reconciled to Mary's rule if she avoided unnecessary bloodshed. But Jane's fate was sealed not by her own actions, but by the rebellion of her father, the Duke of Suffolk, who proved incapable of learning from his daughter's disaster. In early 1554, Suffolk joined Sir Thomas Wyatt's revolt against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, a rebellion that transformed Jane from a pitied victim into a continuing threat to royal security. Mary's counsellors argued convincingly that as long as Jane lived, she would remain a focal point for Protestant resistance, a living symbol around which future rebellions could rally. The logic was impeccable and terrible. Jane had to die not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented to Mary's enemies. The Wyatt rebellion was the catalyst that sealed Jane's fate, demonstrating to Mary that Protestant resistance remained a serious threat to her regime, and that mercy to Jane might be interpreted as weakness by potential rebels. Wyatt's forces actually reached the outskirts of London before being defeated, proving that opposition to Mary's rule was more dangerous than she had initially believed. The rebellion also revealed that Jane's name was still being used by Protestant propagandists as a symbol of legitimate alternative rule, making her continued existence a liability that Mary could no longer afford to tolerate. The involvement of Jane's father in Wyatt's rebellion was particularly damaging to any hope of royal mercy, as it suggested that the Grey family remained committed to opposing Mary's rule rather than accepting their defeat gracefully. Suffolk's participation in the rebellion convinced Mary's advisers that the entire Grey family was irredeemably treasonous, that showing mercy to Jane would only encourage further resistance, and that the family's royal blood made them too dangerous to leave alive. The sins of the father were visited upon the daughter in the most literal sense, as Suffolk's political miscalculations cost Jane any remaining hope of survival. The trial that condemned Jane to death was a foregone conclusion wrapped in legal formalities that fooled no one, least of all Jane herself. She was charged with high treason for accepting the crown that had been thrust upon her, a crime that carried the automatic penalty of death regardless of the circumstances that had led to her brief reign. Jane's defense was both legally accurate and politically irrelevant. She had not sought the crown, had not wanted it, and had tried to refuse it, but none of these facts mattered in a legal system where treason was defined by results rather than intentions. The brilliant young woman who could debate theology in 3 languages was powerless against a political system that had already decided her fate. The legal proceedings that condemned Jane revealed the fundamental injustice of Tudor political trials, where the verdict was predetermined and the evidence was selected to support conclusions that had already been reached for political reasons. Jane's youth, her obvious manipulation by adults, and her willing surrender of the crown when Mary's legitimate claim was established were all irrelevant to judges who understood that they were there to provide legal cover for a political decision rather than to seek justice. The trial was judicial theatre designed to legitimize what was essentially a political execution, giving Mary's government the appearance of legal procedure while concealing the arbitrary nature of royal power. The execution warrant arrived on February 7, 1554, giving Jane just 5 more days of life. She spent those final days in intensive spiritual preparation, writing letters that revealed a remarkable combination of intellectual brilliance and spiritual maturity. Her correspondence with her sister Catherine showed a young woman who had found peace with her approaching death, having concluded that her brief reign had been God's way of testing her faith before calling her home to eternal glory. Jane's final letters were theological masterpieces that demonstrated how completely she had transformed her political disaster into a spiritual triumph, finding meaning in suffering that her executioners could never understand. Jane's final letters revealed a level of spiritual sophistication that was remarkable even by the standards of her intellectually gifted family, showing how her scholarly training had prepared her to face death with a combination of classical stoicism and Christian faith. She wrote to her father with forgiveness rather than bitterness, to her sister with love rather than despair, and to her husband with compassion rather than resentment. Jane's correspondence from her final days showed a young woman who had achieved a level of moral maturity that put her adult manipulators to shame, demonstrating that true nobility came from character rather than birth. The theological content of Jane's final letters also revealed her continued commitment to Protestant doctrine even in the face of death, as she used her remaining time to articulate her religious convictions and encourage other Protestants to remain faithful despite persecution. Jane understood that her execution would make her a martyr for Protestant England, and she embraced that role with the same scholarly thoroughness she had brought to everything else in her life. Her final writings were both personal testimonies and public statements, designed to provide spiritual guidance to Protestants who would face similar persecution under Mary's reign. The scaffold was erected on Tower Green on the morning of February 12, 1554, the same spot where Anne Boleyn had lost her head 18 years earlier. Jane walked to her death with a composure that impressed even her enemies, carrying herself with a dignity that transformed her execution from a political necessity into a moral indictment of the system that had destroyed her. She was dressed in black, as befitted a woman who was mourning not just her own approaching death, but the death of the England she had briefly tried to rule. Jane's final speech was a masterpiece of Protestant theology and personal courage, acknowledging her legal guilt while maintaining her spiritual innocence in terms that left no doubt about her intellectual and moral superiority to those who were killing her. The crowd that gathered to witness Jane's execution was smaller than usual for such occasions, partly because the execution took place within the Tower rather than on the public scaffold at Tower Hill, but also because many Londoners were uncomfortable watching the death of a 16-year-old girl who had committed no crime worse than accepting a crown she never wanted. The witnesses included representatives of Mary's government who were there to ensure that the execution was carried out properly, Protestant sympathizers who wanted to honor Jane's memory, and curious observers who came to see the end of one of the most dramatic stories in Tudor history. Jane's final speech from the scaffold revealed both her intelligence and her character, as she managed to acknowledge her legal guilt while making clear her moral innocence in words that would be remembered long after her death. She spoke in English rather than Latin, ensuring that her final words would be understood by ordinary people rather than just educated elites, and her message combined acceptance of her fate with affirmation of her faith in terms that impressed even her enemies. Jane's last speech was simultaneously a confession, a testimony, and a challenge to her executioners, delivered with a composure that made her seem older and wiser than the adults who had manipulated her into this situation. The executioner's axe fell with a single clean stroke that severed not just Jane's head, but the last pretense that her death had been anything other than judicial murder. Jane Grey died at 16, having lived longer as a prisoner than as a queen, but her brief reign had revealed both the best and worst of Tudor England. She had shown that intelligence, virtue, and spiritual courage were no match for political ruthlessness, but she had also demonstrated that even in defeat, a person of genuine character could achieve a kind of victory that transcended the crude calculations of power politics. The immediate aftermath of Jane's execution was marked by a silence that seemed to acknowledge the injustice of what had just occurred, as even hardened Tudor courtiers recognized that they had witnessed the death of an innocent girl whose only crime was being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The executioner himself seemed shaken by what he had been required to do, and witnesses reported that Jane's death was carried out with unusual solemnity and respect. The blood that stained the scaffold on Tower Green was more than the physical evidence of a political execution. It was a moral stain that would haunt Mary's reign and English memory for centuries to come. The tragedy of Lady Jane Grey was not just personal, but national, representing the waste of extraordinary potential in service of mediocre ambitions. England lost not just a young queen, but a brilliant scholar who might have contributed decades of intellectual and spiritual leadership to a nation desperately in need of both. Jane's death marked the end of Protestant hopes for peaceful religious reform and the beginning of a period of Catholic restoration that would cost hundreds of lives in the fires of Smithfield. Her execution solved none of the problems that had led to her brief reign, and created new martyrs for Protestant resistance that would ultimately prove more dangerous to Catholic monarchy than Jane's living presence had ever been. The international response to Jane's execution revealed the extent to which her story had captured European attention as a symbol of religious persecution and political injustice. Protestant reformers across Europe used Jane's death as propaganda against Catholic rule, while even Catholic observers expressed discomfort with the execution of someone so young and obviously manipulated by adults. Jane's story became part of the literature of religious martyrdom that helped fuel the European wars of religion, demonstrating how individual tragedies could become symbols for larger conflicts between competing worldviews. The historical legacy of Jane Grey extended far beyond her 9 days as queen, influencing English attitudes toward religious persecution, political manipulation, and the rights of minors for centuries after her death. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of using children as political pawns, the importance of legitimate succession, and the moral costs of religious fanaticism. Jane's execution helped establish precedents for protecting minors from the full consequences of political decisions made by their guardians, while her scholarly achievements inspired generations of women to pursue learning despite social restrictions. But perhaps the most important lesson of Jane's story was the danger of treating people as symbols rather than as human beings, a lesson that remains relevant in contemporary politics, where individuals are often reduced to their utility for larger causes. Jane Grey was destroyed not by her enemies, but by her allies, not by those who hated her, but by those who saw her as useful for their own purposes. She became a queen because adults needed a Protestant heir, and she died because other adults needed a Catholic martyr, but she was never valued for who she was as a person rather than what she represented as a symbol. The psychological impact of Jane's story on subsequent generations of English women was profound, as her example demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of female intellectual achievement in a male-dominated society. Jane's scholarly accomplishments proved that women were capable of the highest levels of learning and spiritual insight, but her tragic fate also showed how dangerous such achievements could be for women who lacked independent political power. Her story became both an inspiration and a warning for women who sought to combine intellectual distinction with public influence. The religious dimensions of Jane's tragedy continued to resonate long after the immediate political circumstances of her death had been forgotten, as Protestant England remembered her as a martyr whose sacrifice helped preserve religious freedom for future generations. The prayers that Jane composed during her imprisonment became part of Protestant devotional literature, while her final letters were preserved as examples of Christian courage in the face of persecution. Jane's spiritual legacy proved more durable than her political impact, influencing English religious life for centuries after her death. Today, nearly 5 centuries later, Lady Jane Grey remains one of the most compelling figures in English history, representing the road not taken, the alternative history where England might have been ruled by a scholar queen who valued learning over warfare and justice over expedience. But she also represents the human cost of political ambition, the price paid by innocence when adults play games with lives and crowns. Jane Grey's 9 days as queen lasted less than 2 weeks, but her story has endured for 5 centuries as a reminder that power corrupts not just those who wield it, but also those who seek it, and that the greatest tragedies in history are often the unnecessary ones, the deaths that serve no purpose except to satisfy the fears and ambitions of people who should have known better. The modern understanding of Jane Grey's story has been enriched by historical research that has revealed the complexity of Tudor politics and the sophistication of Jane's own intellectual achievements. Contemporary historians have moved beyond the simple narrative of Jane as a passive victim to recognize her as an active participant in her own tragedy, a young woman who understood the implications of her choices, but who was constrained by circumstances beyond her control. This more nuanced understanding makes Jane's story even more tragic, as it reveals how intelligence and principle can become liabilities rather than assets in corrupt political systems. The enduring fascination with Jane Grey's story reflects continuing concerns about the abuse of power, the manipulation of young people by adults, and the conflict between conscience and political necessity that remains relevant in contemporary society. Jane's refusal to compromise her religious convictions, even when such compromise might have saved her life, speaks to modern audiences who face their own difficult choices between principle and survival. Her story reminds us that some victories can only be achieved through defeat, and that moral courage sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice. The final lesson of Lady Jane Grey's brief life may be that true nobility comes not from birth or position, but from character, and that the measure of a life is not its length, but its integrity. Jane Grey lived only 16 years, reigned for only 9 days, and died nearly 5 centuries ago, but her example of courage, intelligence, and faith continues to inspire people who face their own moments of testing. In a world where political power is often seen as the ultimate prize, Jane's story reminds us that there are some things more valuable than crowns, and some victories more meaningful than the mere possession of thrones. Lady Jane Grey's life wasn't a tragedy of failure. It was a triumph of conviction. In just 9 days, she stood taller in integrity than the men who wielded kingdoms. But in Tudor England, truth was no match for treason disguised as loyalty. Her death marked more than the fall of a girl queen. It signaled the cost of conscience in an age ruled by ambition. Comment below, was Jane a martyr, a pawn, or both? Like if her story moved you, and subscribe for more forgotten figures who shaped history from the shadows.